Hi, Luke here with catsandcarp.com, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how to find catfish. And I'm going to use this reservoir as an example. A lot of people worry too much about their bait and their gear and other things and not enough about location. The most important factor in catching catfish is location. It doesn't matter how good your bait is, it doesn't matter how good your rig is, it doesn't matter how good your rod or reel is. If you aren't putting your bait in front of catfish, you're not going to catch catfish. It's the most important factor by far, but it's also the hardest one to teach. It's the hardest one to figure out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. To understand why a catfish chooses a certain location, you have to understand what a catfish wants. Catfish pretty much want only a handful of things. Number one, they want food. Number two, they want to regulate their body temperature. Or number three, once a year they want to have sex, and they also want to keep from being killed. Okay, so those are the four factors that catfish think about, and that's what governs the four rules of being a catfish that govern all the choices you make. The number one is finding food. Okay, when catfish want to eat, they've got to be close to somewhere where the food is, and they got to be in a situation where they can actually have a chance of ambushing the food. So if you aren't seeing bait fish, if you aren't seeing bluegills, and if you aren't not finding a regular food source, you're going to have a really hard time finding catfish of any size. Especially if you want big ones. Big catfish require a lot of big bait fish to get that size and to stay that size and to survive. So if you aren't finding schools of bait fish and bluegills and things like that, some readily available food source, you're not going to find really big catfish. The second most important thing to a catfish is regulating their body temperature. They don't want to be too hot, they don't want to be too cold. When they're too hot, oxygen levels go down, they become lethargic, it's uncomfortable. When they become too cold, they become lethargic and they can't hunt properly. Their ability to move, how fast they move and how long they can sustain a swim is greatly dependent on their body temperature. So in the wintertime, they're trying to stay warm. In the summertime, they're trying to stay cool. So you're trying to find that sweet spot. Where is the perfect temperature water? And usually that's, I think in an ideal world, that's about the 60s, 60s to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the wintertime, just a fraction of a degree, half a degree Fahrenheit, can make the difference of where a fish chooses to go. So without further ado, let me show you some really classic spots in a reservoir that catfish like to hang out, places that we look for catfish. And let me talk to you about when they work and when they don't work and how to fish it.
One of my favorite places to catch catfish is along emergent weed beds. So you can see here there's these weeds growing up out of the water right along the shore. It's about 3 to 4 feet deep, maybe a little bit less, right there in front of the weeds. And baby fish live and grow up in these weeds, and the catfish cruise up and down the edge of the weed beds waiting for one of these fish to stray too far from shelter so they can snatch them up. This is perfect fishing in the hot dog days of summer, and I focus my attention on points like this one. The points seem to be the best spot, and it's just throw your bait out there a couple feet from the edge of the weeds and just hold on tight. Another great location to catch catfish are docks. Now I prefer docks that sit on the water like this one, as opposed to docks that sit above the water like this one. But you want a dock that isn't super pressured. An old rickety dock that's been there forever and nobody goes on is ideal. Also, moored boats or barges can also have the same effect as a good dock. Catfish tend not to live under docks that much, but they do tend to use them as kind of hunting grounds. A lot of bluegill and crappie and minnows live under the dock, and the catfish will come and make it part of their hunting circuit, and they'll swim by it and hunt by it. This dock is a great example. It gets too much pressure for the catfish to live under it, but I've caught some really big fish, including a 50-pound flathead, right from that dock. Boat ramps are also a really great place to fish. I like to fish the edges of the boat ramp. You'll see that the gravel or concrete extends out into the water for some distance, and the sides where the natural lake bed meets the gravel or concrete is a really good spot to throw your lure. Rock outcroppings are really good, especially when they're next to deep water. There's a lot of cracks and crevices with the boulders and the little caves underneath, and big fish can live in there. Lots of minnows live in the cracks, and the catfish can patrol this deep cliff ledge. The key is to make sure that there's actually some decent deep water. This place, it goes down to about 20 feet, so there's plenty of that. And a little point here, how you see this rocks come out to a point, that's just an added bonus. Undercut banks are one of the best features. If you get relatively deep water next to an undercut bank, that is absolutely fabulous. You'll catch pretty decent sized channel catfish and smaller blues and flatheads underneath the bank, like right in there. Often I'll get in there with a bobber if you're fishing from shore, and just dip your rod tip a few feet from shore, and that's just perfect. Now, of course, if the water's low, this can completely ruin these spots. So water level is really affected by this. But when the water's when the water is normally right at the cut line, and the water's not down too far, this is really great. Little caves and kind of little nooks that go back in under the bank, absolutely fabulous. And the bigger the undercut, the better. Now, one of the keys, though, is it's got to be deep water. If you have an undercut bank that's only like a foot or two deep, it often doesn't do much. But if it's 3 or more feet deep, then you tend to see it holding a lot of fish. The key to undercuts is it has to hold bait fish. If bluegill and crappie are living in the undercuts, then the catfish are going to be in there too. If you ever want to know whether there's a good undercut, throw a little bobber with the worm, and if you start catching bluegills under the undercut, you're going to catch catfish eventually too. So the bait are there, the catfish will be too. But depth is really important. Not all undercuts are the same. Now in this undercut, this is a really good one. I've caught some good fish here. You can see how there's a steep bank that leading right up to the water's edge. You can extrapolate that slope under the water and assume that the water's deep. Now I have a fish finder, and that's the case. The water is really deep. So you can see here there's a nice hill that goes straight down to the water's edge. That hill continues under the water and drops down to about 15 feet really rapidly. So you have deep water right next to an undercut. That makes for a great undercut. That is the ideal undercut. So you can see here the hill goes up quite a ways. The steeper the bank next to the undercut, the better it's going to be, because you can assume that that's going to be a steep slope under the water as well as above the water. You can see here lots of trees hanging over and shading the undercut as well. There's a couple dead trees that have fallen to give some extra shelter. That's all just frosting on top of the cake. But a really nice undercut with a steep bank with deep water is a really good spot if you're going to fish tight up against the shore. Once again, this is a really good summer place to fish. In the dog days of summer, this is a good spot. Not as much in the wintertime though. So let me give you an example of a bad undercut. So here's another shoreline that's really undercut, but you notice how flat it is. There's kind of this little floodplain back there. The water right there by the undercut, even with all this debris, is only like a foot or two deep. Okay, because it's under that magic 3-foot mark, it's really pretty garbage. There's only really tiny little bullheads and stuff in there, and not much of them. When you're looking for good shoreline to fish, make sure you have deep water in addition to attractive features. Now here's a bit of shore that's good almost all year round and that holds really big fish. You have a steep bank, you have a quick drop off, and you have lots of sunken trees and debris in the water. This is an area that'll hold a lot of bait fish, and it's deep, and so it'll also hold a lot of predators. It's great. You see this steep bank going down to the water's edge. You see lots of trees have fallen off the steep bank into the water, and so for every one tree you see above water, there's several underneath. And I like to fish the very bottom of the slope. On the top of the slope, the middle of the slope can sometimes be really good, especially for flatheads. But you'll see a lot more channel catfish and blue catfish at the bottom. But great area. Here in the reservoir, the old riverbank runs right along this edge, and it's really good. Now here's another example of a bad bank. Okay, you see sunken trees, undercut bank looks good, but once again, see it's flat. It's just a floodplain back there. There's no slope to the bank. That spot right there is only a few feet deep. It'll hold the occasional fish in the dead heat of summer at night, but it's not a very good spot. It's not deep enough. The water temperature fluctuates all over the place, and the big catfish don't feel as comfortable in that shallow water. Now here is where the main body of the old riverbed in the reservoir meets a big lagoon. So there's this little point of land on the right, and all that water to the right of that point is the lagoon, and the water to the left of the point is kind of the old main river channel. It's much deeper in the old main river channel. It's about 15 feet, and then in the lagoon it's about 5 feet. So right along that bank you have a really drastic change in depth, and that point of land out, that mouth of the lagoon, is a really good spot in spring and fall for good sized channel cats, and it's a good patrol area for flatheads at night. So it's not a bad place to fish. Big open flats like these can be really good sweet spots for blue catfish in the dead of winter. When it's on a nice sunny day in the cold middle of the winter, these flats can heat up, and the blue catfish can go out on these flats and hunt more effectively in the middle of the winter. So if you start to see bait fish out in the flat, shallow lagoons next to deep channels in wintertime, it's a good spot to target blue catfish. About 5 to 7 feet, sometimes down to 3 or 4 feet, is kind of the ideal lagoon. Also, these are good spots in the dead of summer for small channel catfish and occasionally a decent flathead. Now, one of the keys to keep in mind is if you find bait, you're going to find fish. So if you don't have a fish finder, a cast net is a good way to not only catch bait, but also to locate where the fish are. If you're hitting big schools of shad, there's a really good chance that there are catfish nearby. This is particularly important in the wintertime where the shad school up really tightly. You can see here, this is dead of winter. This is 47-degree water temperature, big school of shad, and there's 3 or so really nice blue catfish at 26 feet of water in the bottom of a really deep channel. See, big school of shad, there's where the catfish are at. In the wintertime, the shad school up tightly, so they're harder to find, but when you find them, there's tons of them. So you can see here, once again, about 47 degrees, this is wintertime. The shad are about 15, 20 feet down, and right there on the bottom, right on the bottom of the trough, right at the edge of a slope, there's some channel cats sitting underneath the shad eating them. So if you find the shad, you find the fish. Well, this has been a really quick and dirty summary of the areas I look for in big lakes and reservoirs. Now, for every rule I've given you, there's always the exceptions, and there's a lot of unique things in each lake that can cause some really interesting hot spots. Some places mussel beds are really awesome, and other places there's hot springs, or there's a weir or a dam, or lots of things that can cause some really unique features. But as far as what you see in lakes and reservoirs all across the country, these are some real basic principles. So hopefully they'll get you on the right track. But get out there and just try a lot of different spots. And if you're not catching fish, move. Don't sit and watch your rod tips all night long. If you're not getting hits, do something differently. And if you keep moving around, you're going to start learning a whole lot more. Anyway, best of luck to you guys. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. I'm happy to answer them if I can. If you like this video, don't forget to check out some of our other videos, including how to catch flatheads and how to fish with live bait. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe.